And this hangout is live. Once again, we are here. This is not the Evangelical Universalist show, but this is the Peter Apostle Superstar show or something.
Let's not spoil too much about what the topic is. I chose the title to be sneaky.
All I know is I don't want people to be misled. I'm not doing any singing and dancing.
Yeah, no, you're not.
Putting that out there.
Yeah. So, by the way, here's my this show is not brought to you by Reed's Apple Brew, but I love it, so I'm going to
send us money.
Promoting it. Yeah, send them money. I love their stuff.
And I'm drinking Busch Light tonight on the cheap. They have it for $2.50 a 6-pack at the store around the corner from here. So
my brother likes to drink Canada Dry ginger ale, and some other family members, not me, decided, well, he should have some real ginger ale. So they got him like triple strength Jamaican ginger ale, and
oh wow,
it was because it was Jamaican. It had pineapple and some other stuff in it. But man, real ginger ale is sharp.
I've made some myself, and I put an awful lot of I used fresh ginger root, and I grated it into my brew. I also threw some fresh turmeric root.
Turmeric root.
Yeah, and it came out pretty good, but you could definitely tell it had a hell of a nose on it.
Yeah. He tried some. It was spicy. So yeah, that was kind of funny. I wish I had been the one. It looked really good too. It was Trader Joe's. It came in a really nice bottle with the cork that had the stopper on it that flips over. It was great. So
you're whispering sweet nothings into my ear.
So this is a Wandering Pilgrims episode, and as usual, it's more chatty. So
that tends to happen with me. I have the gift of gab, as I've been told.
Yeah,
not necessarily in a good way sometimes.
This topic came up. I've known about it for several years, having read it originally in Alfred Edersheim's Life and Time of Jesus the Messiah, which is a really interesting tome full of just all kinds of cool trivial things. He was a Jewish. He was a he was a German Scottish Jew. From his last name Edersheim, but he lived in Scotland. He and his family lived in Scotland, and they were wealthy enough that they sent him to Nuremberg, maybe, or Tübingen. I'm not sure. A major city in Germany that had a rabbinic school, in order to be a rabbi. And while he was there, naturally, part of the training was to talk about Christianity some, and he was very, very meticulous in studying Jewish history, and he got in on this and decided, well, wait, Christianity is true, and so he converted and became a Christian. This happened in the late 1800s. He, I don't know what congregation he joined. Maybe the Congregationalists. He went back to Scotland and married and had a daughter. And he wrote what is still one of the main source material documents on Second Temple Judaism. And also a commentary on Josephus and several other cool things like that, a commentary on the Old Testament. But one of the things that he and his daughter worked on toward the end of his life was a harmonization of the four Gospels. And he went to a lot of historical detail, especially about the connections of various Jewish things that were going on at the time. So when somebody would read this, when somebody's reading the story or they're hearing about these things, then okay, this is the Jewish context for various things that are happening. So he also has a bunch of appendices, and in one of these appendices, he's he gets into this topic in a roundabout way, which I won't follow because it'd take me a while. But in one of his appendices, he's kind of digressing off like I do, only takes a whole appendix to do it, to talk about this rabbinic legend. That the reason he's mentioning it is because it serves in the various Talmudic commentaries. It serves as evidence that the Greek word for stone, which was Petros and Petra, two different, one's feminine, one's neuter, got really did get into the Aramaic Hebrew language and survived even into the rabbinic commentaries. And he has a reason for talking about this, but I don't care about it. But his story, but in a long way of illustrating this, he comes up with this strange rabbinic story that was floating around in several variations. There are 4 of them that I know about, or that he knew about, and I haven't run across any more since reading him. There's 4 versions that we know about. The oldest one is from a medieval anti-Christian Jewish tract called the Toledoth Yesu, which was a repository of material that had been in the Talmuds, the rabbinic commentaries, but had been taken out during the late medieval period because Christians were starting to get more scholastic in learning Hebrew. And so the rabbi was like, wait, we've got some stuff in here about Jesus Christ, and it's not very flattering. And if the Christians figure out what we're saying about Jesus in the Talmud, well, this is going to be a big problem because, they control all the countries and they're not real happy with it all the time anyway. So
it's funny that you mentioned that because I had very, very recently, and I was not aware of this. Now, I had thought that I had read through all the major portions of the Talmud, but apparently I was wrong.
No.
Because
there's 2. There's the Jerusalem and the Babylonian, and one of them is larger than the other, and they don't all entirely share material either.
I didn't get deep enough into it.
That may be why
it was just some, it was some Goy's translation. So,
you actually know Hebrew, so you're ahead of me. So.
Oh no, I used to know. That's a key. Oh, okay. That's a thing. You get a vocabulary of under like a couple thousand in the Old Testament, and so it's a pretty easy language to pick up, but it's also easy to lose if you don't use it. And there's a lot of key terms that when I see them brought up, I remember, but I don't remember all the alphabet. That's how far removed. I mean, I'm talking 15 years ago. But the cool thing is Hebrew is one of those languages. Excuse me. That if you go to Thayer's or Vines, you can get a really good sense of the word if you have an understanding of the idiomatic reference. If you have an understanding of the setting, the mindset, that's really the key. How the Hebrews approached understanding, communication, thinking itself, and it's different between the pre-exile and post-exile because what we know as Hebrew actually came about after Babylon. And before Babylon, it was Proto-Hebrew, and we have very, very scant samples of that.
A lot of the stuff that we have in the Old Testament are translations of older material into what was then the more current idiom.
Right. And a lot of it was word of mouth as well.
Right, the oral translate.
It's just a hugely different culture. Like you take, for example, the Native Americans over here and their wampum beads. You could tell a whole story almost in Braille, sort of.
That's true. Right. Yeah.
Because they're conveying concepts, not like a vocabulary.
Flags. Right.
Yep. The same thing with totem poles, things like that. So it's a very rich language, a very rich tradition. I was very privileged to interact with Michael Heiser a bit about Semitic languages, and I think if there was anything I was going to study, to go to Bible college to study, it would probably be that, Semitic languages. So it's really cool stuff.
In this case, the latest version of this tale that we know about comes from the Toledoth Yesu, but there are 3 earlier versions. I think the earliest version goes back to maybe the 700s or 800s. But you could write a whole master's piece or a doctoral dissertation on this little story because there's so much in there to unpack, and you can use it as an example of how to do form criticism and redaction criticism and some textual criticism and for the various copies that are passed down, source criticism, and so based on the form of the stories and how the stories have changed somewhat over time, there is a sort of core of the story that we figure goes back to. There's probably a core story that does not go back any farther in its written form than the 300s, but it probably does go back to the 300s. And there's because of some other things inside the story, there's a good chance that portions of the information in the story go back farther than that, legitimately back into the 1st century. But it's hard to tell. Again, the story is like you can use it as an example of how historians weigh sources and look at sources and say, okay, this one is historically reliable and this one is kind of trash. Right. Why are there differences between the two? Well, it's because But then on the other hand, it's also an example of how historians can be, once they have a basis for looking at things, they can look at something that might otherwise be trash and say, wait, this would not have the form it has unless there were some actually historical nuggets buried in there, and we can identify those. Recently, back in September, Justin was either in a thread or had started a thread that was talking about various days, various theories about different days for Jesus' birth, since almost everybody agrees December 25th isn't the actual day. Right. There are some theories for that it being the actual day, but most scholars say that's not the actual day.
I think that the people who said it actually made an apology as to why it's not the actual day.
Yeah.
Like at the time when it was set, the councils circling around it. I can't remember specifically what I'm talking, but I think I remember a commentary on that saying that, well, they know that they were basically trying to replace Saturnalia, that they were redeeming it, but that they knew it wasn't.
And I talked about this somewhat in our previous episode on the Nativity and universal salvation, because some of that had to do with the question of whether the Nativity stories, the day of Jesus' birth, was it set during the Feast of Tabernacles for that year, which would be in the autumn.
And I think most qualified historians would agree with you that that's most likely.
Yeah, but there's those theories too. One of the nice things about it being the Feast of Tabernacles, however, and specifically September 29th, which is the feast for Michael and All Saints in the older Catholic churches, is that if you go back 40 weeks, which is the ideal gestation period for a human, then you have Jesus being conceived on or around December 25th. And so then that would explain why during the 300s, when they were trying to compete with the Saturnalia and also just kind of pull everybody together so that everybody was off at the same time instead of having overlapping holiday schedules, they might have said, okay, well, we can bring it back to here because this is an important date.
Quite literally, that would be the date, the start roundabout the date of the incarnation. Yeah,
right. That's the start of the date of the incarnation.
The birth,
I guess nowadays we call it the Advent. Yeah,
right.
So in this thread, I was briefly mentioning that I was with the Feast of Tabernacles theory and specifically September 29th, and I mentioned along the way that there was, among other reasons, there's this weird anti-Christian rabbinic story floating around from dating back at least as far as the 300s, but the forms are back in the 700s and the 1200s and so forth, that tries to explain, the whole reason for the existence of this story is to try to explain difficult facts that the Jews of the time had to acknowledge, but they couldn't figure out exactly how to account for it in a way that didn't look good for Christianity. And so they came up with these stories, these kind of semi-humorous fantasy stories, kind of to as propaganda for explaining how could these things be true and yet Christianity be false. And one of the things was, how did Christians stop going to the temple and doing Passover and start doing Easter instead? And how did they stop going to the temple for the Feast of Tabernacles and start celebrating Jesus' birthday instead? So there was a connection that they knew about prior to the 300s where Christians celebrated Jesus' birthday in the Feast of Tabernacles.
Right.
Okay.
And this is all, today is all filtered through, 1,500 plus years of a semi-pagan incarnation of Christianity. The transition from paganism to Christianity in the Roman Empire was not a smooth one at all. And there was a lot of holdovers, a lot of things that carried through, which I don't necessarily have a problem with because it's all ultimately his story.
Yeah, and it's a question of baptizing things. If you can baptize people, you can baptize things too and bring them into the service of Christ. So
I think the Eastern Orthodox communion is a very nice counterbalance to the Roman Catholicism hegemony over Christianity.
And they have some of each, though. There's good pros and cons either way. I like them both.
Yeah.
So anyway, so the story. So I've having told about this, not going into the details really about it, but just kind of hinting that this thing exists. Dustin and some other people are like, "Hey, I've never heard of that." And I said, "Well, we should do a show. We should do a Wandering Pilgrim show on it, and I'll tell you the story behind it." And so a few months later, here we are. I was trying to work up trying to get one more evangelical universalist show in before the end of the year. So I was studying on that. And then we got closer to Christmas. Like, well, if I'm going to do a nativity show for Christian universalism from the Gospels, then I probably need to do it this year, because by the time next year rolls around, I plan to be out of the Gospels. So finally.
Hey, Donald Trump could have been revealed as the Antichrist by then, and we could be in the midst of World War III. The seas might be blood.
I don't think he's going to turn out to be the Antichrist, but who knows? There may be something like that coming. I don't know.
In all seriousness, I just remember James saying, take heed, saying you're going to go to such and such town, make such and such money. You never know what tomorrow brings.
Yeah, you're right. You never know what tomorrow brings. And you're saying, well, you should be saying you'll do that if God so wills it. Correct. And right. Instead of saying, I'm definitely going to go off and here and here. No. Be humble. Say, if God wills it, you'll go off and do that. It's a very Jewish thing to do. So anyway,
are you calling me a Jew?
We should be, kind of. Yeah, I mean, we're inducted into the promises.
I just love the fact that that's the one word that's both an insult and a compliment at the same time. But I'll leave that alone.
I don't even think it's an insult. I think it's great.
I know, of course not. Of course not. I'm talking about the stupidity in the world today.
Right. Yeah. So. It kind of depends on how they behave, which of course is a big theme in the Old Testament too. So,
as long as they don't have a really hooked nose and they're not going like this, looking at me with their money in Google, okay, then we might have a problem.
Yeah. Well. So anyway, we are going to have to talk about some Jewish misbehaving here, but I don't mean it as being hostile, because it's very interesting, and we can kind of get past various things that have happened. We can sit down and go, oh, this is pretty freaky. We'll talk about some freaky Christian history.
One thing that we can agree on is, as far as people groups go, they are one of the most smartest people groups on the face of this earth. And they have shown that from the very beginning. Yep.
So here's the story that they came up with to explain these various things that they wanted to explain. Okay, so the story starts back after the death of Jesus, and in the story they never call him Jesus. They don't want to use his name, so they'll call him the Crucified. You may remember seeing that from other Talmudic sources.
Oh, and that's of course an attempt to shame him, because that's an accursed thing.
Yeah, it's a cursed thing. He was hung on a tree.
Yeah.
The Crucified One. After the death of the Crucified One, there was a lot of commotion and chaos among the faithful Jews. Some of them wanted to follow him, and others didn't. And the ones who there were these 12 highly respected Jewish men who were good Christian sages, not Christian. They were good Jewish sages, but they had converted to Christianity, and they were going around doing these various things and leading the people astray. And it was interesting that in the source material here, they do acknowledge that the 12 apostles are men of good reputation. It's like they have to deal with that. That's something that's in the tradition, and they have to deal with it. So they're and as you're going to see, this really kicks into gear later. So they're allowing that these are men of good reputation, and yet they're going around, they're leading the people astray. And one of the results of this is that when the followers of the Crucified come to the temple to do the services for Passover and tabernacles and some other things, they cause trouble for the people who aren't following Jesus. And they get into fistfights, and they try to beat and molest the Jews and the non-Christian Jews, and cause all kinds of problems with it. And I think this is interesting because you see some of this the other way around in Christian texts from the period, only it's the Jews who are causing trouble. And in this case, it's the Christians who are causing all the trouble, not the Jews. The Jews aren't causing any trouble. And there's probably truth in there in the middle. It's just either side's not really talking about what their side was doing to cause problems.
Right.
So the so they're like, well, okay, gosh, what are we going to do about this? This is just intolerable. We've got to come up with some kind of plan or something. So during one of the feasts, I think it was Passover, a bunch of the most respected and well learned Jewish sages all get together, non-Christian Jewish sages get together and have a prayer meeting, essentially. And they spend time fasting and confessing their sins to God, and very pious. I mean, very, very straightforward, pious operation here so far. It's not going to stay that way, but it starts off good. And but nothing's. They're not really coming up with anything, and they're hoping that the what did they used to call it? The Kahal Baal. You remember what I'm talking about? The voice of God, the divine voice, the voice from above. We'll come up with some. It's what they used. It's what took the place of prophecy after the deportation to Babylon, which was their way of explaining why there weren't any more canon, there were no more canonical texts being made. But this took over helping with the rabbis in the synagogue and so forth, and so this was the voice from heaven that God would send to help people out, and they were hoping that they would get inspired to come up with some plan here that would help create peace for the Jews in this situation. Right. So, excuse me. So they're talking about, they're sitting here praying about this, and then one of the most respected of the sages stands up, and everybody's like, "Oh my, yeah, okay, we may have a chance here, because this guy, he is so awesome that he has actually earned." This is their way of mind thinking about this. He has actually earned from the heavenly voice a miraculous favor that he can cash in at some time. Okay, so he's probably got a plan. We'll listen to this plan. So this sage, this highly respected sage that everybody loves, he stands up and he goes, "Okay, brothers," he said, "I've got a plan." Everyone's like, "Yeah, he's got a plan." And he's like, "Okay, but y'all need to listen because this plan is really messed up." He's like, "Okay, the basic problem here is that the crucified one did not teach his followers to hate Judaism." Well, they're like, "Oh, well, yeah, that is kind of a problem, yeah, because they keep coming to our feasts and they're causing problems." He said, "Right. If only the crucified one had told them that he hates Judaism and therefore he despises the feasts and they should stop going to the feasts, they would not be coming to the feasts." And I'm like, well, yeah, that is true. I guess that's right. It's too bad he's dead, but he's like, "Okay, so," he says, "so here's what I'll do. I volunteer to be Satan." He doesn't spell it out like that, but based on the context, that's what he's doing. "I'm going to go to the Christians and I will volunteer to be Satan to them. I'm going to go to them and I'm going to deceive them into them thinking that I am not only one of the followers of the crucified, but I'm the best one. And that they need to be following me because I knew him best." And everybody's like, "Well, I mean, these people are kind of dumb, but they're not that dumb. They're going to wonder why they've never heard of you before." He says, "I've got that covered. I will ask for a favor from the divine voice. Remember, I've got a miraculous favor coming from the divine voice, and I've got a good idea on how to fix that problem." He said, "But here's the problem." He said, "If I do this, essentially what I am doing is I am making sure that these people will have no place in the next life, because I'm going to convince them to stop coming to the Feast of Atonement and these other things, and consequently they're not going to have their sins atoned for anymore at the temple services, and they're going to be screwed. Which is a super evil thing to do, but I'm willing to do that for the sake of making peace for our people." They're like, "Well, okay, that's it's pretty hardcore. I guess we respect that." He says, "Okay, but I have conditions." He said, "The first condition is I hope y'all remember that I'm really a good guy." "Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, man. You are the best. You are the most awesome person ever." "Okay, yeah. The second condition, because I'm never going to once I do this, I'm never really going to be able to come back in and be part of the Jewish people anymore, because otherwise they'll know the game will be up, So the other thing is I'm not going to be able to go to the feast myself and get the atonement and stuff. So you guys have got to vow to take the burden of the sin that I'm about to do upon yourselves and atone for it. So they're like, yeah, we understand, man. It is totally cool. We will do that. We understand the situation you're volunteering to put yourself in. You're not going to be in a position where you can work your way out of it. We'll do that for you. Well, we'll be the ones to say, yes, you please go do this. We'll take the sin of it upon ourselves. Okay. He's like, all right, I'll do that. And y'all remember, but for the rest of your life, y'all think good for me for the rest of posterity that Simon Peter was this really great guy. That's who this is. This is Simon Kephas. Okay. This is Simon Peter.
Mm-hmm.
In this story, he's an ultra respected sage, a Jewish sage who is highly regarded by all Jews everywhere. And so now they have to try to figure out, why is he a Christian? Why did he do this? Why would somebody as awesome as Simon Peter do this? And there's another question here too. Why in the 300s and further on down the line, why is he still regarded as being such an awesome, faithful Jew? By this time, why would they even think that? Well, there is a reason, and we'll see that later. All right, so he goes to the temple, and he goes into the Holy of Holies, and he takes, he goes to a corner, and he prays, and he talks to the divine voice, and he says, you promised that I could have a thing here, and I'm trying to save our people. So here's the plan, and I'm hoping you'll agree with this and go with this. And God says, sure, yeah, well, I'll do it. He says, I'm asking you for permission. Let me write down the ineffable name of Jehovah, the Tetragrammaton, on a piece of parchment or papyrus or something. And
I'm just a stickler about that.
Yeah, I understand.
I'm sorry, I had to jab.
And I'm going to cut a slit in my arm, and I'm going to stick the name written on the paper into my arm. That way, I'll be able to do miracles with this arm, and that will convince these people that I was sent by God. And in this story, God says, yeah, sure, that's a great idea. You do that. Okay, you've used up. Yeah, I had to give you a miracle because you were so awesome. So yes, I'll do this for you. This is your request. Very well, I'll do that for you. This is sort of this whole approach is totally mind-boggling to a Christian. Of like, this is not how a pious person would operate, but this is how they think. Okay, so
it kind of reminds me of David and Solomon and the promise that God had made to give Solomon whatever he asked.
Yeah,
something along those lines.
Right.
So you could see why a Jew would buy that.
Like, yeah, I guess may I have wisdom, please? Yeah, that's a great thing. And then you can have all this other stuff too. Well, that makes sense. This is more like, yeah, can I have divine power to act as Satan to these people to make sure that they have no place in the life to come? Sure, that sounds like a great idea.
Well, yeah, I mean, think about how Jews read the scriptures. They still won't have dairy with meat in a meal. So
yeah, well, because
it's just their thing.
So anyway. Not all Jews are like that, but what's interesting
is that
this story was passed on by people who thought this was a good idea. Okay, so he does this, and so then he goes to the city, the metropolis of the Christians. That's how it's actually called in the story, the metropolis of the Christians. And later, it's going to be obvious this is Rome. All right. So this is why the earliest version of the story we can be sure happens around the 300s. So.
Wasn't Peter crucified in Rome too?
Yes, he was crucified in Rome. Yeah. Upside down. I was upside down according to legend.
Yep. Yeah, an X-shaped cross.
So he goes to. This actually is not part of the story. It's a thing you bring up. That's very interesting, but they don't really explain that in the story. We'll see what happens to him. So he goes to the metropolis of the Christians, and just like according to the plan, he shows up and he says, "Hey, my name is Simon Peter." And I used to be the biggest fan of the crucified one, and I was his closest companion, and he told me a lot of things. And I know y'all are doing your best you can, but you need to be corrected on some stuff you're doing here. And I'm here to tell you that Jesus really did not like Judaism. He kind of spat on it. He said to reject it and stop going to the temples. He didn't like the feasts. And also, you should stop messing with the Jews, and instead, if they want to beat on you, you should let them beat on you. Also, I mean, like if a Jew slaps you on the cheek, you should turn the other cheek. And if a Jew asks you to walk, carry his burden 1 mile, then you should carry his burden 2 miles. That sort of thing.
Which is what Jesus said about the Romans.
Right.
In his time.
Yeah. But notice now, the form of the story is such that the people who are coming up with the story, they know that in their experience, the Christians are actually all really nice to Jews. So how are they supposed to explain this? Well, it's explained by Simon Peter coming along and convincing them to be nice to Jews, because otherwise they wouldn't be nice to Jews. All right. So that's how they're explaining this in the story.
Right.
So he's saying, you should do these various things, but definitely stop going to the feast. That's bad. You should be, and listen to me, because I'm going to be the biggest teacher. I'm the guy who really knows what's going on with Jesus. Now, you don't listen to those other people. You listen to me. So, of course, the other people, the Christians there, only being slightly retarded, they're like, well, where did you come from? We've never heard of you before. You just kind of popping up out of nowhere. You seem kind of suspicious. Maybe we don't want to listen to you. How can you now? Their approach to this is very similar to rabbinic stories, and you can see some of this in the Bible too. When Jesus will say something, and the rabbis and sages around him will go, "Okay, yeah, we need to see a miracle from you in order to verify that this is truly coming from God." And sometimes he'll do one, and sometimes he won't. But this also happens in the Talmud, as you know, because there are lots of stories where So this is a normal sort of Jewish story trope. So they're saying, okay, you seem kind of hinky, but if you can do a miracle from God, we'll have better trust. So hey, he's got the arm of power now. He's like, yeah, watch this. I raise a person from the dead. Bang. I can cure this leper by touching him. Bang. I don't remember if he actually touches him or not. But anyway, bang. Cures the leper. I can do these things.
Pulling a Benny Hinn on them.
Yeah. So I can do these things the way that Jesus did. That impresses them. So they're like, okay, I guess we'll just, Mr. Nobody, who we never heard of before, I guess we'll accept that you used to be the chief follower of Jesus. Interestingly, in the earlier detail of the story, they knew 12 people were following that Jesus had 12 apostles who were men of good reputation, and he becomes the 13th apostle, so to speak. But you shouldn't really press the details too far, because a lot of this is just kind of, it's thrown in there because it sounds good, but it's also because they have details that they know about that are problematic, and they're trying to reconcile them. Okay. Mm-hmm. Like, Christians are really very nice to Jews, so why? How did that happen? That seems kind of weird if Christianity is this freaking blasphemous perversion of Judaism. How did that happen? Well, it's because Simon Peter used to be a really good Jew. He still is a really good Jew. We should all honor him. But why is he a Christian then if he's this awesome Jew? Oh, that's because he was a spy. He volunteered to go and pretend like he was a Christian in order to do these things. Okay, so now
I'm sensing a bunch of layers here. I'm sensing the story.
It's a multi-layered story. It's really interesting.
I'm sensing the plot and the story. I'm sensing the people who believed it. Then I'm sensing the Christians, and it's like this is like Inception in history.
Yes, it's like Inception. Yes, it's very true. Yeah. So there's lots of layers to this. It's like a layer cake. It's all very cruel. I just geek about it every time I think about it. It's so awesome. So it's like it's totally insane, but it's great. Okay, so now really his plan, if he could swing it, was, according in the story, Simon Peter's plan, if he could swing it, is to just do this and then leave, and hope he can go back to just being an awesome Jewish sage. And but the people are like, yeah, but would you stay here with us and teach us and so forth and so on? He's like, well, yeah, I kind of made provision for that. So in case they ask me, I guess I better, because if I don't, then Hang on just a second. I'm at the office, so people have come in.
Well, while Jason's talking, I'll entertain you guys with my interesting little anecdotes. Well, I find this very interesting. I always find it funny thinking back to these historical narratives about how you see both the suspension of disbelief because people want to believe in a miracle, and you can even see the same thing today. But even in the midst of that, you got the on the other hand, you're thinking, but doesn't this seem like a little too good to be true? And why people would actually cling to these things is rather understandable once you realize how mundane their lives were. The life that Christ brought wasn't as spectacular as miracles on a daily basis. And so people eager for a miracle will grasp at what they see. So, and Jason's back.
Okay. Yeah, and I may have to move along here because there was some family sickness going on, and I may have to help. Okay, so not yet, but we'll see. Mm-hmm. So he's like, okay, yeah, I didn't really want to do this, but I've made provision for it. So he says, okay, I'll stay, but under these conditions. First, I want y'all to build me a tower here in the city, and I'm going to live at the top of this tower. And this tower is called the Rock, and that's why his nickname became Simon Peter in the story. I'm going to live at the top of this tower. And I'll stay here for the rest of my life. Also, notice that this type of thing going on is similar to, it may be kind of a later detail, it's similar to Christian mystics getting what's called stylites who would live on top of towers and not come down. So that's kind of what he's doing in this case.
Like he says, a guru above the clouds.
Yeah, now he's not. I mean, it's not that tall, but it's still it's there. And he's like, I'll live on bread and water, and that's all that you'll feed me. And for however long I live, that's how long I live. And they're like, okay, we can do that for you. So they build him a tower, and he moves in at the top of it, and he never leaves it again. And that's all he eats is bread and water. And the story goes that the bread and water, the reason he asked them to do that was the bread and water of repentance for misleading them. Okay. But they don't know that. So he's doing that, and he survives another 4 or 5 years doing that, but that's as far as he lives. During that time, he never, according to the story, even though he did this, he never served anybody. He never served any god but the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's a nice little benediction for him. But during this time, he writes a bunch of liturgical hymns, and he sends them out all over the world.
Let me guess. He converted.
I don't know what you mean. He's
Christianity.
No. He's still a Jew. He sent this out. He sent these liturgical hymns out to be sung in the synagogues, so that people would always remember him as being a good Jew. And this story detail is so fascinating. Because it makes no sense as a story detail unless at the time the story was circulating, there were still hymns being sung regularly enough in Jewish synagogues, non-Christian Jewish synagogues, that were believed to be or known to be written by Simon Peter and sent to them, circulated around. And so I'm like, and these hymns are still being, one of the versions of the story says, and these hymns are still being sung today. And that makes me wonder, are any of the hymns dating from that time still being used in Jewish synagogues today? And if so, are some of those maybe written by Simon Peter? It's not a detail. It's not a detail that just seems like out of nowhere. It's like a detail that they had to account for. That was a historical reality at the time that they were coming up with the story, and they had to account for it. And so that it's like that's really interesting. Now maybe they had gotten mixed up somehow, but it's still weird that it would be him.
How much of this do you think is actually true?
I think the Jewish hymn part is true. I think that.
Well, what I'm saying is this, was this an actual guy that named Simon Peter who infiltrated this group of Christians? Was
No. I think Simon Peter was really a Christian, and really was chosen by Christ to be part of his lead team.
Oh, of course. I'm talking about the dude 300 years later. Do you think that this actually happened?
Years later, I don't know how was he coming up with this? But I think he has various information, and they're trying to figure out how to spin the information so that it comes out in favor of Judaism and not in favor of Christianity. And so they've got these details. Simon Peter, he's the leader of Christianity. He's the guy who convinced them to stop doing Passover and to start doing Easter. He's the guy who convinced them to stop celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles and to start celebrating Jesus' birthday instead. Or maybe he didn't, and that's just something that they latched on to him. But that was a thing that also happened. They remember that the Christians used to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles and then came to celebrate Jesus' birthday instead of the Feast of Tabernacles, in parallel with Passover and celebrating the death of the crucified one. Okay, in their minds, he didn't rise again, so it's just the death of the crucified one.
Now, in my understanding, we actually have a nice historical roadmap as to how the Roman Catholic Church arrived at these dates for these holidays superimposed over the feasts and whatnot. Right.
So, but they have a different testimony, they have a different tradition that you're seeing echoes of in this story. They know that that this guy that they believe to be Simon Peter, the leader of the Christians, that was a really awesome Jew, and that he was a very pious Jew, and they can't really seem to say anything bad about him. Why is that so late? Well, it's because they realize he's the guy who sent them these hymns that they're still singing in the synagogues. That's why he still has such a great reputation among them, and why they have to come up with some explanation for where those hymns came from. He wrote it during this time, which leads me to believe that he did write those hymns during a later period in life, maybe when he was in Rome and he thought he was going to die or something, and that was his evangelism outreach, and he wanted to send these hymns around and circulate them around so that the Jews would remember that they had such a high opinion, they still had a high opinion of him, and that they would remember him in their services. And that's what apparently happened. They accepted all of these hymns. They thought they were so awesome, and that they had such a high reputation for him, and but they couldn't, in their mind, figure out why he would be a Christian. And so they came up with this 4,000% insane story. Also, they knew he did miracles. They remembered that he did miracles, that they had a tradition of doing miracles like raising the dead and healing lepers and so forth. How could he do that if Christianity isn't true? Well, because he was an awesome super Jew, and so he received permission to do these sort of things.
Super Jew.
He was a super Jew, right? He's Simon Peter superstar. But if he's Simon Peter superstar, why is he a Christian, Mom? Why? Why is Simon Peter a Christian? Well, it was a trap.
It was all a trap.
It was a trap. He did it in order to stop the Christians from abusing us. Yeah, because Christians don't abuse us, Mom. They're really nice. Right. But once upon a time, they abused us. And it was Simon Peter who stopped that.
They were the devil.
Yeah. And it was Simon Peter. And he was Simon Peter's kind of become Santa Claus here. But Simon Peter is a really good guy. And so he did this. And this is why he became a Christian. He wasn't really a Christian. He'd always worshiped the God. He never did anything other than worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But he pretended to be a Christian in order to do these things for us, so that the Christians would treat us better. Well,
and I thought Saint Nick was so hardcore for punching Arius.
Huh?
I said, wow, and I thought Saint Nick was so hardcore for punching Arius.
Right. Well, yeah, Saint Nick is like the patron saint of pirates and archers and all kinds of really cool things.
So now Peter's going to be the patron saint of covert counter-ops.
Yeah.
He was 3rd century opposition research. He was 3rd century fusion GPS.
So, Yeah. So okay, so he does eventually die, and so his hymns go around, and after he writes them a few years before his death, and so his hymns go around, and so they're still celebrated at the day of this legend being developed. So to help explain this has helped explain this. Okay. But then there's an epilogue to the story, and the epilogue, the core story is basically the same. There's some little extras in there to help explain little details here and there, which makes sense. But the epilogues vary, and so that's the epilogues are clearly tacked on. So in these epilogues, I think there's actually 4 different versions to match the 4 different kinds we have. I mean, they're pretty variable, but they all have basically the same theme. In these epilogues, after he dies, another guy comes up who tries to be the same thing. He's like, oh well, this worked well for Peter. I'll do the same thing. Only this guy, whoever he is not a good Jew. Sometimes in some of the stories, his name is John, and in some stories, his name is Paul. Okay. And so,
John Paul, not a good Jew.
Yeah. So he shows up and he tries to run the same confidence scam. All right. And
was this that guy? Was this that guy that played bass for Led Zeppelin?
Don't know. So
John Paul Jones. It was a funny joke. John Paul Jones.
So he in my mind, that was like an admiral for the Revolutionary War period. So he's the first American admiral. Okay.
Probably was.
So,
I don't know.
That's where I think of John Paul Jones. That's probably what the Led Zeppelin guy was named after too. Okay, so this new guy comes in. He tries to run the same scam. He's like, "Oh yeah, I was really the best apostle, and this Simon Peter guy, he was a flake. he wasn't anybody. Actually, it never. And this is why it's. And this is interesting too, because whether it's John or it's Paul, whoever this is, and they both did this, it never, this person will come in and say, it never even entered the mind of the crucified one to disparage the feasts. So in some ways, he's actually trying to get them to be better Jews. But he'll come up with other stuff. He'll say, like, if you want to be circumcised, if you want to be baptized or not, it doesn't matter. If you want to be circumcised or not, that's great, but it doesn't matter as long as you're baptized. And if you're baptized, you need to be baptized in filthy water. That's obviously a joke dig that's been added in there, and some other things of this sort. And so these other unkosher things, but he's actually trying to convince them to get back into doing the to respect Jews in other ways, respect Judaism in other ways.
The festivals and ceremonies and whatnot.
So they ask him the same thing. Well, we've never heard of you before. Where did you come from? Do you have a miracle that you can do to test this? And because they're apparently willing to just kind of change over to this guy if he can do a miracle. And he's like, yeah, sure. What kind of miracle would you like? And immediately, a meteorite from heaven falls on his head and kills him stone dead. And that's the end of the story, because that's the humorous end of the story. He couldn't really back up his thing, and so God kills him with a miracle.
And again, I'm always left wondering just how much of a historical root there are in these anecdotes.
Yeah, well, obviously there's not a lot to work with here as far as the details go, but apparently the part of that, of course, is that the rabbis really, really do not like Paul, which makes sense, because Paul was
Can't imagine why.
Who learned from the feet of Gamaliel 1, and so he would be the main competition. So
yeah, that's why he didn't sign his name when he wrote the book of Hebrews.
Yeah,
I think I worked that in just about every other episode.
That's okay. That's all right. We can disagree with that. So they know that these other major Christian teachers like John and Paul were also respectful of Judaism, and they can't quite figure out how to square that with the idea of these people being Christians, and so they come up with these kind of flaky stories about them to try to square that up. But in this story, there's not much detail to go with there. But there is a lot of interesting detail to go with the Simon Peter side of the story. and that it's interesting. It has little bits of thing, like, for example, the Christians celebrating. It's evidence that now Eidersham didn't notice this. I think in his book, he actually I can't remember if he argues for a traditional December 25th date or if he goes for the spring, not for the fall, certainly. But he didn't seem to notice that in this story that he was collecting the source material on, that the Jews did remember a time when the Christians did switch over from the Feast of Tabernacles to celebrating Jesus' birthday, and that there had to be an explanation for this, and so that was integrated into the story about Simon Peter. So that's it. That's all.
It's interesting. It's a lot of funny Jew stories.
This is a neat little trivial gem that I ran into several years ago, and it has it's fun and entertaining, and
you got a couple of comments on the YouTube page. Of course, Vince and Justin both say hi, and some dude at End Times Army. Hey, oh geez, we got the fanatics following us now.
Yay, End Time Army!
And Justin says, and they wonder how they get sneaky conniving rep. Hey, Justin, that's anti-Semitic. Okay, listen. What was that? Go ahead.
I was going to say he should read some of the other Talmud stuff too. Well, he probably has. Some of that's really interesting. Some of that is really, really interesting, but some of it is so bad. It is so bad.
I think he read the same link that I was talking about at the beginning of the broadcast, where it was talking about how they were saying that Jesus wanted them basically to drink his semen and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's in it's pretty awful.
Yeah, it went super graphic, like the whole blood and flesh and all that stuff. But yeah, this is okay. This is the thing. Human nature is human nature, and this is what we got to remember. And
right.
One of the most one of the most dangerous things is for a person without guidance to have a lot of intelligence. My life has been a testimony to that. I've had some rough times, and it's usually because I outsmart myself and I rationalize and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So this is my personal experience from my research. I do believe that the Semitic people, specifically the Jews, especially Ashkenazi Jews, evolved one of the greatest verbal IQs that this planet has ever known. Use. The good Jews did good things with it. The bad Jews did bad things with it. And that's where these stories come from, is, good people flock together, bad people flock together. We always remember the bad ones because the bad ones make the most noise.
And they're entertaining, and they're like, oh, well, that gives us a reason to oppose them more.
And everybody loves a scapegoat. Everyone loves to villainize a whole group of people. So I'm not with your average evangelical saying that, the Jews are super special and we need to fall over ourselves over them. But I'm also not anti-Semitic in any way, other than to say, when you're dealing with a smart person, understand they're smart. When you're dealing with a person who's good with money, you might want to get some advice before you enter in a deal with them. When you're dealing with a person who's really good with mechanics, you might want to think twice before you bet your skills against theirs. So it's really that simple. I think I've known every ethnicity across the board except for Australian Aboriginals, and my experience has been there's good and bad in every group, and it usually emerges according to whatever strengths or weaknesses are inherent in that particular strain.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis used to say a very similar thing, I think, in Mere Christianity, in those lectures, that you have a cow, and the cow can be good or bad, but there's not much to that. You have a dog can be better or worse than a cow. You have a person can be better or worse than a dog. You have an angel can be better or worse than a man. The more talent and power and potential you have, the better he can go right or the better he can go wrong. And that's true about everybody. And it's a main theme of good drama too, is as a person levels up, so to speak, and as you might say in today's gaming parlance, how is that person going to put that to use? There are new temptations and new opportunities to do bad things, as well as new opportunities to do good things. You can have different stuff going on there. So
yeah.
anyway,
I just want to know the secret to getting my hands on some of that Jew gold. But until then. Hey, I could say that because Ben Shapiro says that, and he's Jewish.
Oh, does he say the same thing? Does he want to get his hands on it?
Just about every Jew I know loves Jew jokes. Okay, I've never seen a Jew get offended over anti-Semitic jokes at all. They're like Asians. Asians are the same way. Every Asian I've been friends with makes fun of themselves twice as much before I can even get to it.
It's better if we're making fun of ourselves. It's not quite as much the same thing if other people are making fun of us. So.
I can give you. Sorry about that. Siren. A quick sociological explanation of this can be exemplified through iron sharpening iron. Now, this is where a lot of people groups have friction because some are more cooperative than others, some are more tribalistic than others. And Northern Europeans traditionally have been very non-tribalistic and very competitive with one another. And that competitiveness can rub others the wrong way that are more cooperative in nature. And so that's the great interactive problem that we have in the 21st century, especially connected from globe to globe, is we're talking about different modes of thinking being centuries removed. Well, there's also different modes of thinking that are geographically removed and culturally removed that we're wrestling with to this very day. You and me, we come from very different cultures and we live in the same country.
And yet, somewhat similar cultures too.
Oh yeah, yeah.
We're both basically. There are a lot of people who both think that we're rednecks, and there's some argument for that.
But we're definitely not ignorant rednecks.
Right.
We have. What it comes down to is that the world has gotten a lot smaller, and we have so many attributes to each of our in-groups that it's overlapping like a Venn diagram. So when those differences do emerge, they seem starker than what they really are. Yeah. And that's why I say, I try to explain, a good friend of mine on Facebook is Bola Muyas. He's a Nigerian, and he's like one of that more cooperative mindset. And I'm always giving him crap, and I'm like, but that's how I like you. If I'm picking on you, I like you. If you're pissing me off, I'm just going to start ignoring you, Mm-hmm. And that's a difficult cultural ladder to climb for some people because for example, my wife's extended family, they're Puerto Ricans by way of Philadelphia, and they will never understand my humor. They will never appreciate it. To them, it's all super disrespectful and crude and rude, and I'm like, but that's why it's so funny. And it's just you're either of that mindset, of that culture, or you're not. And I don't expect other people to enjoy it. It's just we need to learn not to judge each other so much. That's my way of doing it. When I talk about Jew gold and things like that, making fun of it, that's me marginalizing it, saying, well, it's silly enough to make fun of. It's nothing. We all have our differences. It's fun to have fun with them.
Yeah. As long as the other person realizes that. Then,
of course.
Yeah, because if not, then there is a problem.
It's a tug of war. Yeah. Nothing's ever simple, and that's the biggest problem we have with the sociological movement we're having today. Most clearly exemplified in the Me Too movement is that we forget too easily what a negotiation relationship is and life is, especially when there are such big differences between the way we're approaching life. And so somewhere along the line, we cease negotiating and we get to assuming. And
yep. Well, I've got to call. Yeah, I can see people approaching here, and I'll probably have got to go help other people. So this will be my good night for the night.
All right, I'll give the final farewells to everybody. Okay. You can go ahead and sign off. Have a good one, Jason.
You too. Hey.
Well, thank you everybody for joining me. I love little stories like this. I'm just pulling up the. I got two things going on here, because my desktop will crash if I just do it on that. So stories like this illustrate exactly what I was just talking about, how the Jews of the time felt so at odds with this other group that threatened them demographically. Oh, Jason still hasn't hung up. You still there, Jason? Jason's back. I still haven't
Well,
signed off yet.
fortunately, it wasn't anything bad, but I do need to sign off and go check and make sure that some sick people are okay. So
All right, all right.
about that. So bye bye. See y'all later. I'm gonna
Have a good night.
hang out. Okay, bye.
Bye. All right. Now, just in closing, this illustrates what rivalries do to our relationships with one another. We gotta come up with these ways to outdo one another. We gotta come up with these schemes. And I think this dude Simon Peter was probably an actually very virtuous dude. I think that he very much believed in what he was doing. He believed he was doing God's will. Obviously, he was asking for God's favor for it. Um, where that breakdown between a person's actual God-given conscience comes in, the breakdown between that and the contrivances of their mind, you can't judge people too much because we all do it, every last one of us. And this is a good educational moment. I know Jason gets his enjoyment out of it for his reasons. For me, it's always a sociological study and psychological. I love understanding how these things come about and why the Jewish community and the Christian communities and the pagan communities were always at tension with one another, and the great lengths to which they went to show their supremacy and all of that. It should remind us how lucky we are today that we have such a tolerant culture and that we don't feel that need to suppress one another. And we should take that as a lesson. Don't quickly let that go, because if there's anything we could use a little more of in this world, it's understanding. And I'm not saying that everything should be tolerated. Certainly not everything should be accredited or be given accolades or honor. But understanding goes a long ways towards tolerance as well. So I'll step off the soapbox and I'll leave the platitudes behind. I hope everyone has enjoyed this broadcast. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and we will see you again the next time when we decide to shake the foundations of church presuppositions and all of that stuff. Bye bye. Good night. God bless.